Okay, this is 3.1 day 2, starting on page 165. I to the 8th, we can think about how many I squareds are there. There are 4 I squareds in I to the 8th, and I squared is a negative 1. So negative 1 to the 4th power, negative times a negative times a negative times a negative is a positive. So the answer is 1. I to the 19th, can't take I squared out of it yet, so take an I out first. So it'd be I times I to the 18th, which would be I, and then the 18, you can think now about the I squareds. Okay, so 18 would be 9 I squareds, which is the same as negative 1 to the 9th. Negative 1 to the 9th is negative 1 times I gives you negative I. I to the 102, that would be I squared to the 51st, which is negative 1 to the 51st, which is negative 1. Okay, when it's a negative exponent, we're going to take that and shift it to the bottom, so 1 over I to the 15th. And if we take an I out, because it's 15, can't take I squared, so it'd be I and I to the 14th, which would be I, and then we can think that's I squared to the 7th. And negative 1 to the 7th power gives you negative 1, so it'd be negative 1 over I. Okay, if you remember, we don't like I in the denominator, so you multiply by I over I, which is I over negative I squared. I squared is negative 1, times this negative makes it a positive 1I. I to the 12th would be I squared to the 6th power, which is negative 1 to the 6th, which is 1. So we just get 1 there. 84, since this is negative, it moves to the top, so it's really just I to the 46. Okay, that would be I squared to the 23rd, which is negative 1 to the 23rd, which is negative 1. 2 negatives here cancel out, and this would be I and I to the 14th. This would be I and then I squared to the 7th. And I squared, which is negative 1 to the 7th, would be negative 1. So we have negative 1 over I. Multiply the top and the bottom by I because we don't want the I in the denominator. So we have, the answer is negative, I on the top. On the bottom we have I squared, which is negative 1. Cancels out with that negative to make it just positive I. Okay, number 90. The conjugate of negative 3 plus I would be negative 3 minus I. 92, that would just be square root of 7. So square root of 7 times square root of 7 would be square root of 49, which works out to be 7. Okay, so it gets rid of that square root part. And you could either say I or negative 8I, or I, anything like that is okay. 96. Okay, we have negative 7 over 3I. Okay, so what we can do to get rid of it. Now, if you use this idea, you would multiply by negative 3I. We can also just multiply by I. I personally think that makes it a little bit easier. I over I is 1, so we're just, yep. So negative 7I. On the bottom, we have 3I squared. I squared is negative 1, so it's negative 3 on the bottom. And negative over negative is a positive, so 7/3 I. 98, negative 19 minus 9I over I. Okay, so once again, we can just multiply both the top and the bottom by I. So it would be negative 19I minus 9I squared over I squared. I squared is negative 1, times that makes that positive 9, minus 19I over negative 1. And if you take that negative 1 through, be negative 9 plus 19I. Negative 12 minus 5I over 3 minus 2I. Okay, so here we have to multiply by the conjugate here, which would be 3 plus 2I. Okay, so we just multiply here, be negative 36 minus 24I minus 15I minus 10I squared. And 9 plus 6I minus 6I minus 4I squared. Okay, simplifying it all, this would be I squared, so it makes that positive 10. We have a negative 36, makes plus 10 is negative 26. And then adding those two together, they're both negative, would be negative 39I. On the bottom, those cancel. Negative 1, negative 4 makes it a positive 4, makes 13. And lastly, we can divide it all by 13. So we have negative 2 minus 3I. $102. We have negative 6 plus 8I over 1 minus I. Once again, multiply by the conjugate, 1 plus I. Because we don't like the I in the bottom, so this is how we get rid of it. Notice the middles cancel out. So, negative 6 minus 6I plus 8I plus 8I squared. 1 plus I minus I minus I squared. Okay, so I squared is negative 1, makes that negative 8, makes negative 14, combining like terms. Combine this together, plus 2I. On the bottom, the middles cancel out. I squared is negative 1 times this negative plus 1. Plus 1 is 2. And reduce it, you get negative 7 plus I. And 104, last problem, 2 minus I over 2 plus I. So once again, you want to multiply by the conjugate, 2 minus I. So on the top, we get 4 minus 2I minus 2I plus I squared. On the bottom, you get 4 minus 2I plus 2I minus I squared. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 and 4 make 3 minus 4I. And those cancel. 1 be 5. So 3 minus 4I plus 5. Divide by 5. All right, there's the homework.